Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Tomer Malchi of the Israel-based company Asio about soldier-borne technology, the future of combat in the 21st century, and much more. And then we break down the major speech from Defense Secretary Hegseth and President Trump to hundreds of U.S. generals and admirals at Quantico, Virginia, and we examine the cultural divisions around more American performers agreeing to perform at events in Saudi Arabia. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. My esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times, will be back next week, but we've still got a packed show coming up this week, including a really in-depth interview with Tomer Malchi, the founder and CEO of the Israel-based company Asio. So we'll get some insights from a key defense industry figure outside the United States on everything from humans' role in 21st century combat to drones and a lot more. But before we get there, first things first, as always, and there's quite a bit to run through this week. Of course, we have to start with the major speech from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and President Trump to the hundreds of generals and admirals brought back from posts all over the world to Quantico, Virginia, to hear from their leaders. And a quick side note, I wanted to thank Sirius Radio's POTUS channel and Fox 5 in Washington, D.C., both of which had me on the air this week to talk about that event. But here's the biggest question. What was the actual point of this? Sources I've talked to think it was largely a waste of time and a lot of money, by the way. It's not cheap to fly generals back to Virginia from, for example, South Korea, Guam, Africa, and we could go on and on. But for Hegseth and Trump, there was definitely a PR element to this. It was a rally the troops style address, but that's not to say there wasn't actual policy, because there was. And some of it on the surface, depending who you talk to at least, looks a little troubling. Defense Secretary Hegseth said they are instituting newer and tougher fitness standards for troops. Physical training tests twice a year, weight and height measurements twice a year. He took direct aim at the, quote, fat generals and admirals, unquote, walking around the Pentagon. There's going to be new combat tests and more. All of this, Hegseth said, is part of a broad effort, his warrior ethos, he says, to ensure, among other things, that people inside the armed forces are promoted solely on the basis of merit, not their race, their religion, their gender, and the like. Of course, it's worth noting that we rarely get actual examples publicly of people who were seemingly or allegedly promoted for those reasons. I guess we can assume, if we read between the lines, that General C.Q. Brown, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and former chief of naval operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, were among them, since they were fired shortly into the new Trump administration. But I think what jumped out to me the most were two aspects of what we heard here. One, Hegseth said they're going to review the definitions of terms like hazing and toxic leaders. Now, proponents of that new approach will say this could stop the trend of qualified leaders being pushed out, having their reputations besmirched by allegations of bullying, internal investigations, and more. But critics, of course, will say it opens the door to actual abuse of recruits and service members, in the name of, under the guise, I guess, of hazing, for example. By the way, Hegseth also said they're going to overhaul the Office of Inspector General at the Pentagon and the Equal Opportunity offices inside the Defense Department. That means it's going to be harder, I would almost guarantee, harder for complaints to be filed in the first place and investigations to even get off the ground. So those are changes to really watch, because that's consequential. It may seem kind of down in the weeds and a little bit technical for some listeners, but those are potentially very significant changes to how complaints and investigations are filed inside the military. The second thing that got a lot of attention, and rightfully so, was President Trump's remark about using U.S. cities as training grounds for troops. That comment, which seemed, at least to me, to be made kind of off the cuff by the president, really struck a lot of people the wrong way. And look, even if you think that the president is 100% right to be sending National Guard troops into D.C. and other cities, active duty Marines into Los Angeles. The idea of using cities as training grounds suggests that this is going to become the norm in the United States of America. And it's worth reminding everybody, I think, that even though this kind of already feels like it's becoming normalized, it's pretty outside the norm for the United States of America. And so it's just worth keeping that in the back of your mind that, we typically haven't done a lot of this except in extreme circumstances in this country in the past. I'm going to unpack all of this in more detail coming up in the Washington Times, including how it's impacting the view, in the upper echelons of the armed forces of Hegseth's leadership, his worldview, his style, his general attitude toward officers. He told all of them at Quantico to basically get on board with what he wants to do or to do the honorable thing and resign. And we haven't really heard a defense secretary talk to officers in quite that way before. And I'm in the midst of doing a deep dive into how that's being received up and down the ranks. So be sure to read the Washington Times for that. One more thing quickly here before we get to a great interview with Tomer Malchi. Longtime listeners are very well aware, of course, that we talk a lot on this show about the Golden Dome missile shield. And that's because whatever you think of the Trump administration and his Pentagon leadership, the Golden Dome is inarguably one of the most ambitious and potentially important national security undertakings in this country in a long time. But as with all projects of this size and scope and ambition, the price tag is a big factor, and there are major conflicting reports about what that price tag actually is. My colleague Vaughn Cockayne dove into this issue this week and explains how in current spending plans, current lawful budgets in the United States, which of course there's a government shutdown right now, so that's a little bit in flux as it is. But as it currently stands, only $25 billion of federal money has actually been allocated to the Golden Dome. President Trump said the system could ultimately cost $175 billion. A Congressional Budget Office report recently said it could cost as much as $542 billion. Now, these are all just numbers. And I know a lot of people's eyes glaze over when we talk about federal spending, and with good reason. Mine do too. But I think it's important with the Golden Dome because this is literally technology that's never been used before. For example, space-based missile interceptors. So nobody knows what it's going to cost. Literally, nobody knows. Nobody inside the government or in the defense industry, even if they tell you otherwise, can accurately predict what the Golden Dome is going to cost over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and beyond. And that's a problem because maybe the Trump administration is willing to throw endless amounts of cash at Golden Dome because the president truly believes in the project and sees it as a signature achievement of his. But will the next administration feel the same way? Could they pull the plug on the Golden Dome if, for example, Democrats control the White House and both houses of Congress in a few years? And then what happens? We have a half-built missile defense shield that doesn't do the job. What does that mean for America's long-term security? Pentagon projects always seem to go over budget. I know a lot of our listeners are either in the defense industry or do business in some way with defense industry firms or with the Pentagon directly. So that's no surprise to you. But there is a world in which the Golden Dome goes, I think, so far over budget that it fails just for that reason. I don't exactly know how we would go about doing this, but I think to the extent it's possible, we need to try to get a realistic, long-term cost projection that everybody agrees to on the table soon and stick to it. Or I think the long-term viability of the Golden Dome project could be in real danger just because of the money. And we are joined now by Tomer Malchi, the founder and CEO of the Israel-based company Asio. And I'll let Tomer tell you more about the company in just a second. But he has a very impressive resume with decades of experience across the military, intel, technological realms. He was an officer in the IDF's Special Field Intelligence and Reconnaissance Unit. Tomer, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So right off the bat here, for listeners who don't know, rather than me do it, in just a minute or two, if you could, tell us a little bit about Asio and what you all do there. And specifically, I know you have a flagship system that you'd like to talk about as well.
Of course. So Asio is a very innovative company. We've started, I started with my brother. We were both at the field intelligence and reconnaissance, and we were wondering if things can be done better. We were a little bit disappointed with the stuff that we were handed off, paper maps and stuff that were old school even 10 years ago. And we figured out we can do something different to empower the war fighters right at the edge where you have most of the load, let's say. And we thought about bringing the consumer technologies that was so far ahead in like 10 years ago, rather than like in the 80s or 70s, where the defense technology was the tip of the spear. Right now, the consumer technology or the commercial technology was much faster going. And we decided to take, the high-tech innovation approach and the technology that was running from computer vision to AI to system engineering, and bring them into the defense, but not just to the platform like tanks and airplanes and ships, but right down to the war fighter at the end, which is, I think, the most difficult platform in the world. That individual combatant or war fighter is the single most complicated platform, war fighting platform in the entire world. And one of its many drawbacks that it has to sleep, it has to eat, it has to, stay alive, and those kind of things. And it's a really fragile platform, unlike a tank that is very armored. And we thought about how do we bring all the capabilities that could support that maneuvering forces down at the edge, which is, let's say, the battalion level. What did they need? So the first thing, they need situational awareness. They need to know where they're going, what they're doing, how to plan a mission, how to execute a mission much better. So, for example, in the world today, we have, once we had MS Project from Microsoft, now we have Monday or Slack or all of those platforms that helps us manage our day-to-day development or project management or project development. We wanted to have those kind of, let's say, simple and effective tools in the hands of combatants in letting them plan their missions or execute them much better with a lot more information involved. So we developed the Orion platform, which is similar, or it has similarities to ATAC, which is the U.S. Army platform for Android mission management and planning. The Orion is much more rich, I think, with intelligence, with accessorizing situational awareness and data. It's connected to other systems that we develop as a platform, like an AR augmented view monocular, or an aerial GNSS denied positioning or navigation system for small or tactical drones or UAVs. And this gives like a suite of capabilities for the maneuvering forces in which they can much better operate.
Okay, we'll get into some more specifics about combat manpower and the role of human beings going forward here. But I want to ask one kind of broad question before we drill into that. I know one thing that Asio works on is helping forces function in GNSS denied environments, global navigation satellite system denied environments. We've become really interested in that issue here in the show and at Threat Status, because this question of whether militaries around the world, not just the U.S. military, not just the IDF, whether we're kind of broadly getting too reliant on tools and capabilities that need the internet, that need satellites, that need connectivity to something in order to function. And I've gotten the sense, especially over the past couple of years, that there's a real push in the defense industry now to develop capabilities that function without that. How important is that today? And do you think that there are still some militaries, maybe including the United States, that are still too dependent on satellites, internet access, and other systems like that?
So it's a great question. And I think that you could see it. So let's put aside just a second the military uses. Let's talk about our personal life. Everything we do is position oriented. You go about your life, and Google Maps are floating information for you based on your position. And the weather service is based on your position. And you get a lot of stuff based on your position. And your Waze navigation and everything you do today is very, very, let's say, used or dependent on positioning. Even in the background, stuff that you don't even know about, pushes that you get that are position based. And on the military spectrum, that gets even worse, because position is everything. C4I or battle management system, they want to know where you are in order for other forces to know where you are. If you're talking about the skies, the air traffic controllers for the military domains, they want to know where a drone is. Otherwise, it can crash into a plane full of soldiers or an F-35 and crash those, and that's $100 million go down the drain, not to mention the collateral damage. Every type of control that you can think of today is position-based. And we've got so accustomed to using GNSS, and GNSS is so good. It's great. It's an excellent sensor. It's cheap. It's reliable. It's accurate, but it's not reliable. That's the thing. In the past couple of years, more and more we could see the unreliability that GNSS can generate. And the thing is, in many cases, what's called spoofing, which is kind of like deceiving the GNSS. So you would think it's fine. It would look absolutely perfect. All the parameters or all the health parameters would indicate that it's perfect, but it's actually completely somewhere else. In this case, it would be very difficult for you to mitigate that error. You wouldn't know if it's not working. Say, okay, it's not working. Let's do something about it. But if it's working perfectly, just wrong, that's a whole different problem. So I do think that the aerial domain today is heavily dependent on GNSS. The tactical UAVs or UESs, the what's called Group 1 or Group 2, which is the small medium size, are more dependent because from two types of reasons. A, it's cheap and it's good when it's working. The problem is when it's not. The alternatives are very difficult. Inertial is not that good in aerial platform, and the ones that are very expensive or very heavy. Radars or RF based are not that accurate or don't give a full solution. Therefore, leaving a very important gap that really holds back, let's say, the autonomy level of those platforms and the safety and everything. Now, the directive of the Pentagon today, other than just drone in general, is autonomy. So they want to see autonomy and they want to see it now. And they've issued replicator program, for example, autonomy, BVLOS. BVLOS is beyond visual line of sight operation. That means that you can operate your drone without actually seeing it and controlling it manually. You can depend on it doing its mission independently. Autonomy again. So no position, basically no autonomy. And that's a real drawback. And we have, in Asio in general, we have kind of like picked that up like a good while back ago, like 2017. And we started handling and developing and thinking and generating architectures that are GNSS denied operated even back then. So we have tons of experience and we've encountered a lot of, let's say, kind of like edge situation, or we've handled a lot of cases. So we have a very robust understanding about how to operate drones in a GNSS denied operation.
Okay, very good. I want to drill a little bit more into sort of modern day combat manpower. And of course, we have multiple conflicts raging around the world right now, including the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war. Can you help our listeners, amid this discussion of technology that we're having here, understand the role of actual human beings, manpower in the 21st century? What do human beings need to be able to do today in the modern day battlefields that we're seeing? And then number two, what do they need to have on them? Soldier-borne technology and capabilities. How has that changed what we expect human beings to be able to do in today's combat? And what tools do they need today that maybe even a couple of years ago they didn't even need to think about?
So let's take a very short history dive. So World War II, Korean War, Vietnam even, you didn't have much else to go on. World War II, troops, you had to physically take over land in order to get that land. And you wouldn't have any significant things achieved if you won't be physical there. During, for example, the Vietnam War, they start what's called a bombardment campaign. Use a lot of aircrafts, a lot of sorties, drop a lot of bombs on areas, but in the end of the day, they weren't that effective. They were bombing jungles, but in the end of the day, if the troops didn't go in and finish the job, the jungle would have just been, taken back by the Viet Cong or the enemy, whatever. And I think Kosovo was a very important tipping point in that aspect, where the Allies thought that we'll go to Kosovo, we'll do a massive air campaign, they'll surrender, we'll just go in, set everything where we wanted it to be, and we'll be over with. And after weeks and weeks and weeks of massive bombardments in Kosovo, they had to go in. And I think we saw that in the Gulf War, the 2003 Gulf War, same thing, massive air campaign, but in the end of the day, you have to go in. I think the Ukraine showed that as well, but with a lot more force, because the drones had a very important effect of deneutralizing platforms, tanks, APC, all the armed carrier, personal carriers, et cetera. And in the end of the day, the only thing that was very effective, other than drones, taking down distillery or infrastructure, is maneuvering forces. The troops that are going village to village, area to area, clearing up that area, putting up the flag like you used to do 100 years ago and say, this is ours. And no airplane in the world and no F-35, F-16 with any massive campaign could generate that effect that this is mine. You have to go in, put in the flag like you had to do 100 years ago. And I think the Middle East campaigns, the North, the South sectors would also be heavily invested in maneuvering forces, in actual forces in land. And no air campaign could give any substantial results. So I think that the massive interest in the troops today is very correct. That's kind of like the vector that we're seeing.
This kind of begs another question on this point, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. At what point, when we talk about technology and soldier-borne capabilities, at what point is it too much? Do you reach a point of diminishing returns where you have a soldier outfitted with, too many augmented reality goggles or sensors to measure biometrics that they're weighed down and can't actually move quickly and efficiently as you just described? How do you sort of balance those two things right now?
So I think the answer to your question is very simple. I'll answer it in a second. But there were and there are what's called future soldier programs for 30 years. They started in the early 80s, where communication started, boosting up, 90s for sure. And they ended up, I call it like a Christmas tree, when you have the soldiers, like the tree and everything, like wrapped with cables and with systems and sensors. And there are two very important factors. A is the cost. You have to remember, if you have an army with 40 or 50,000, let's say, front-end combatants, and each system like that costs $50,000 or $100,000, just you won't have enough money, and it's too complicated to maintain. This is vector number one. It has to be cost effective, because the multipliers are huge. You don't buy a squadron of F-35s. You buy stuff for 50,000 soldiers that you have to maintain. That's a real cost. The what's called the life cycle cost of that system. A. B, and I think this is the most important vector. We call it, when we were in the army, it's what's called the stay in the tent effect. Everything you don't need or you don't want, in the end of the day, if your life depends on it and it's a weight, you just leave it in the tent. So in the end of the day, if you try to push technology and the soldiers just don't use it, they leave it in the tent, then that's your biggest indication that's too complicated, too massive. The soldier won't take stuff that would hold them back. They just won't take it. And I think that's the greatest indication about a successful system that is really designed for the end user, that is a warfighter or something that was designed by engineers with all the stuff,
right,
that is practical.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I mean, you get it out there, and does the soldier actually take it with them? Because if they don't, then they don't need it. And yeah, right.
Chooses to.
Yeah.
Chooses to. Yeah. If it's the choice, if you give him a pistol or you give him an AR-15, they'll take the AR-15 because it's a much suitable weapon with firepower and everything. But if you're giving a huge machine gun, they would still take the AR-15. You know what I'm saying? So that's how you differentiate, but something that is practical and useful for the soldier, something that he doesn't want to use. It's heavy or bulky or whatever.
Right. Tomer, a couple minutes left. So one final question to finish up here. And I realize this is a question we could probably talk about for the entirety of a 20 or 30-minute interview. But I want to ask for your take on sort of where Israel and the U.S. stand in terms of technological advantages over adversaries right now. We talk a lot on this show about the axis of authoritarians, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, maybe Venezuela now as well. And specifically recently talked a lot about China's military buildup, the stuff they had on display at their military parade a couple of weeks ago. And you know, of course, better than anybody, Iran talks a pretty big game when it comes to its drone program, its missile defenses. But Israel, you know, pretty quickly, and from at least my vantage point, seemed relatively easily rendered Iran's air defenses almost powerless a few months ago, allowing Israel and the U.S. to carry out airstrikes in Iran. Do we overestimate where our adversaries are, what they're capable of technologically today? Are the U.S. and Israel and, you know, this traditional post-World War II global order we always talk about, are we still significantly ahead of where any of our adversaries are in terms of military technology today?
I think that the broad spectrum, I think that we are ahead, but not that ahead of every. I think that we tend to give too much credit to ourselves. We won, we were successful, we're so much better, there's so much worse. I think that's the worst thing you can do, is to underestimate your opponents. This is A. B, I do think that technology plays a role. Not everything, but it is a role. And if you would ask me what is the key component here, I think it's integration of all the capabilities to one coherent, let's say, war-fighting machine. That the Air Force is integrated with the troops, that are integrated with their aerial platform, that is integrated with their information systems, and you could have a much, let's say, tighter circle of understanding, assault, lethality. Everything is a lot more, let's say, in tuned or integrated together. And I think that the U.S. and Israel are doing it very, very well. So from the time you're thrown into a conflict until you understand which is which and what is what, and you're able to be effective in your mitigation procedure, I think this is where things play out the most. And I think Asio's capabilities do exactly that, by building situational awareness down at the lower end that can connect to higher platform like air power, like tanks or the cavalry or the fire support, and give very rapid indications about where the threat is, what is the accuracy of the targets that we're giving. These kind of things build up very rapid response. And in the end of the day, whoever blinks first loses. And I think that if you have the capability to see the enemy faster, to have its coordinates detected faster or more accurate, and you can respond faster, you, in the end of the day, have the upper hand. And I think that technology bring that capability a lot better and help the field operators to have this upper hand.
Tomer Malchi, the founder and CEO of Asio, thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much for having me.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. And my threat of the week is increasing cultural divisions in this country, the United States, driven by, what some would call sports washing by Saudi Arabia, or more recently, perhaps comedy washing. I think most listeners have probably heard at least a little bit about the Riyadh Comedy Festival in Saudi Arabia, which is still going on as we record this, and the fact that major American comedians, a lot of whom I really like, such as Bill Burr, Louis C.K., Kevin Hart, Dave Chappelle, Pete Davidson, and others performed at that event. And by the way, they were paid a ton of money to do so, and they haven't denied that fact. But other comedians who I also really like, such as Mike Birbiglia and Mark Maron, criticized their fellow comics for going to Saudi Arabia and, according to at least some people, accepting money from a regime that has a horrific human rights record. So this is a really complicated issue. And from our perspective here at Threat Status, it's hard to talk about it without bringing into the conversation the deep geopolitical and national security importance of Saudi Arabia to the United States. That's why, in the U.S., under administrations of both parties for decades, America has maintained such close ties to Saudi Arabia, despite a host of controversies, from how women are treated to the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and other examples. But this isn't just about comedy either. We can talk about the Live Golf Tour. Listeners know I'm a huge fan of pro wrestling, and WWE for years has taken tens of millions of dollars to hold events in Saudi Arabia, including upcoming flagship events like next year's Royal Rumble and WrestleMania in 2027, and to do so has accepted restrictions on, for example, what female wrestlers are allowed to wear. The comedians at the Riyadh Comedy Festival also apparently accepted restrictions on the jokes they could tell. No, of course, as you would imagine, making fun of the royal family or of Islam. But the reason all of this is my thread of the week is because we're now seeing big dividing lines here in the U.S. over whether somebody is willing to do business with the Saudi government and take their money for these kinds of events. There was a lot of vitriol, as I just said, directed at those comedians. WWE has taken a ton of criticism for holding shows there. Live golfers, at least initially, were excoriated for doing this. I don't know where this goes and how it impacts American sports and culture over the long term, but that's exactly why, to me, this is a threat. We're in uncharted territory with this, and I just wonder what happens if, for example, comedians start getting blacklisted from late-night comedy shows because they appeared at a Saudi event. Could a future administration here in the U.S. try to block American performers from going? Is it possible that the cultural clashes around this get so heated that it actually impacts the America-Saudi Arabia relationship and, by extension, U.S. national security and foreign policy? I don't have the answers to any of those questions. And maybe this just dies down. And like a lot of other things, this kind of thing becomes so normalized that we don't really even bat an eye at it anymore. But I wanted to highlight it this week because a lot of things right now, from foreign policy and finances and money and sports and comedy and pro wrestling, are all intersecting here at the same time. And I'm afraid the divisions over it here in this country are only going to grow deeper. So with that, a big thank you to Tomer Malchi of Asio for joining us this week, and a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Guy Taylor will be back next week. In the meantime, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we'll see you next week on the Threat Status Podcast.